So it's right before pupation. I think the larva defecates. It has one defecation event, and then it spins its cocoon.
Takes a giant
it's a pre-pupa,
and then spins a cocoon.
Yeah, and they eat all summer, and
From now on,
they poop.
every time I have to go to the bathroom, I'm going to refer to it as a defecation event.
You are listening to Urban Wildlife Podcast.
Doug Sponsor, what did you see?
We saw squash bees. I think there were 2 male squash bees, if I'm not mistaken. With a lot of bees, the males can be distinguished. Well, if you have a microscope, you can actually count the antennal segments, and they have an extra antennal segment. They have 13 instead of 12. But if you're used to seeing bees and you see a bee that has antennae that just look a little longer than you're used to, that's probably the male of the species.
Doug's an entomologist who studies bees. So he's not just a guy off the street who claims he can eyeball squash bees like this. So we are in let's call it a West Philly community garden owned by the Walnut Hill Community Association, where I've got a couple squash plants. We're here with Doug Sponsler and
Tony Crosdale.
And this is Billy Brown. We're trying to do a quick conversational episode about squash bees. Do you see them flying, or were they in the flower?
They were flying. I think we spooked them, actually.
Okay, we'll back off for a second.
Yeah.
So for setting the scene some more, this used to be like, I guess, a twin, if you're familiar with West Philly housing. And is there a cardinal over there that's upset at us, perhaps? You know, in some places, the houses fall down, and then they're vacant lots, and this is one that years ago had been turned into garden space. And it's got a few garden beds in the back. And in one of them, I threw a couple seeds of a squash I like, fairy squash. It's a hybrid out of East Asia, and it's fabulous. And the species, it's funny, when you read something all the time, you never know how to pronounce it.
Yeah.
Cucurbita moschata, it looks like.
Oh.
Moschata.
So it's not Cucurbita pepo.
Pepo would be like acorn squashes, most what people think of as pumpkins and zucchinis. This one is the one that butternut squashes are, along with a bunch of other ones that we don't see sold quite as much. My favorite of all the Cucurbita are the Cucurbita maxima, which is like Hubbard's, and one of my favorites I ever grew, jumbo pink banana squashes. I'm a big fan of squash and gardening, so I can go on. I might go on forever. And there's one other one that produces something that you see in the Deep South called Cushaw squashes. And you'll see those for sale sometimes. They're like big squashes with like a neck that kind of curves, and they got green and white stripes. And so you see them sold. It's like one that's more commonly grown like in Central America. They just renamed the species, and I can't pronounce the new name. Those are the ones you see grown in temperate areas. Anyhow, so the advantage that this variety has is that it has solid stems. So there's a moth called the squash vine borer.
It's a really beautiful pest.
It's a beautiful pest. Yeah. It's this moth that looks a little bit like a wasp. It's got these... Hey, podcast listeners. I'm cutting in here because I screwed up my description of the squash vine borer adult while we were out there. It's a clear-winged wasp-mimic moth with a red and gray body and black-veined clear wings. It really is quite pretty, even if I wish it would go extinct. And it is a vile little animal if you like squash, in that it sort of lays its eggs at the base of the stems. The larvae eat into the stems and then live inside the squash, eating the inside of the stem for a while. And then one day the entire plant just dies. Because it's sort of cut through, sort of eaten through the stem enough, and you don't know it's there to fight it until the whole plant's dead. And so one of the ways you avoid it completely is to plant squash that don't have hollow stems.
Hey Billy, I might take you up on your offer of DEET.
I've been walking around with some
they
some
are out
spraying
today
in my pocket. So if you've never been in West Philly or another row house-based kind of city, landscape is you have a lot of row houses fronting the street, and then behind them you have gardens usually, or just little yard spaces, but it's all very well shaded, and then you've got enough clogged gutters and little pools of water, and it's always kind of shady, and so you have tons of mosquitoes whenever you're behind a house in West Philly. Welcome back to another episode of the Urban Wildlife Podcast. Why did I think this was an interesting urban wildlife topic or wildlife topic at all. Billy, why did you think it was interesting? All right.
Yeah, but why did you? Why am I?
Why did I drag you out of your bed?
I love you dearly, but I did wake up at 5:30. Luckily, I only live a 10-minute walk from you, so.
So the reason is that I love squash peas. The reason I find this stuff fascinating is that, Tony and I both professionally, recreationally do like native plant gardening, right? So like we're standing in the space where I've been pulling out exotic plants and like planting native ones, like we're looking at a fence that's covered in Virginia creeper. And the reason it's not covered in porcelain berry is because I keep killing the porcelain berry and favoring the closely related native, the Virginia creeper. And then, I don't know, what else do I kill back here? Like everything. I just was pulling out some Ailanthus saplings. And behind Doug, we've got like some woodland sunflower, some Jerusalem artichoke, which is basically another sunflower that people grow for tubers. And then there's a viburnum behind them, and then some joe pie weed, and then
purple coneflower.
Purple coneflower I got going on over there.
Let me just say, as somebody who thinks a lot about plants and pollinators and stuff, this is a beautiful place.
Okay.
You've chosen very well.
And I've got and then lower in the beds, I've been like pulling out other things, but leaving like the violets and I've got a complicated relationship with the white snake root. Because they'll take over completely, but it is very much a native and has very nice fall flowers. So I've been sort of trying to leave some balance of that. So basically,
the story of the milk poisoning role
I do, but it's fascinating. And how did it play a role in the death of Abraham Lincoln's mom? Go ahead, Doug.
I don't know. This is kind of hearsay, but the story goes.
I looked it up. I think it's legit.
Yeah. Milk poisoning used to be fairly common because white snake root produces a toxin that when cows eat it, they produce poisonous milk. Most of the time, it's noticed when nursing calves die. But sometimes if you drink the milk, it can kill people too. And I think the story goes Abraham Lincoln's mother was killed due to milk sickness.
From the cow getting into the white snake root.
I don't see any cows around here. I think it's probably a safe place to cultivate white snake root.
Yeah. So anyhow, I've been doing all this work because I like native plants and stuff, and a lot of these are great for pollinators. I even have these moments where I was reading a book by a good friend of ours called The Ecology of Center City, Philadelphia, Ken Frank, the author, and wrote about something called Pennsylvania pellitory. It grows up along sidewalk cracks. You see it all over the place. It was not taking over, but it was one of the things I yanked out of beds. And then I realized, I read his book, I'm like, oh no, this is native also. And it's actually a host for red admirals, which is one of my favorite butterflies. And it's related to nettles, basically. And so I've been leaving some more of that, not yanking all of it out. And what are the reasons we do native gardening? We do it, maybe some preference for the plant species, but also because it tends to fit in better with the community of insects, mainly, and then everything that eats insects. And it's something that I've noticed, I paid more attention to, probably because Tony's got me into birding, is that when you're in up in the Poconos, or even just I was along the riverbank on the Schuylkill, where it's mostly willows and silver maples and box elder, all stuff that's native. You see birds foraging there and just coming out with tons of caterpillars. Or when you're out in what I'll call intact woods, even though they've been logged 4 times, but it's mostly native stuff. And you walk and there's moths flying up with every step, and you're turning you're at night and you're camping, you turn on your flashlight and you see army of spider eye shines in the leaf litter when you look around. Part of what we're doing,
it's probably a nightmare scenario for a lot of people, but I think it's pretty cool.
I think it's really cool too. It's because you turn the light, you're are there really that many spiders? And yes, there's tons of spiders because there's tons of other bugs. So part of why I do this, and I think why a lot of us do this, is because we love all the animals. So we're looking around. We love the whole sort of network of animals that eat the plants, and so then when you plant stuff for vegetables, it's sort of all right, a lot of times you're planting exotics, but then when it comes to stuff like this, it's in this fun gray area for me, and so that's why I want to drag you to bed.
Squash bee's back. There he is.
So he's buzzing around quickly. We're going to stand back.
Notice their flight pattern is pretty distinctive. it gets very different from what you'd see from a honeybee or a bumblebee, right? If you're used to watching them, they're much more slow and deliberate. But the squash bees we're seeing now, their flight pattern actually reminds me more of the way flies
I agree. Yeah.
tend to circle and be more erratic.
So like right here where we are in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
Oh, there he goes. Oh, he's in. Oh, no, he's not. I'll talk. They're not bothered by sound.
So
I guess.
this is a female in here now.
Oh,
I think.
they look a little bit like honeybees, but they're a little flatter with narrower bands. Is the best way I could distinguish them.
And they have kind of like noses. The part of the insect face called the clypeus, which is where you'd imagine a nose to be on an insect, protrudes unusually far in squash bees.
Okay.
So that's another distinctive.
Usually, what I'm looking at is their butts, because they're head down in a squash
Yeah,
flower.
yeah.
And for those who haven't seen squash flowers, are big yellow flowers, like they can be 6 inches across, and it's fun when it warms up a little bit. Squash bees are like I think of them as morning people.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's why we're at like 6 in the morning.
There's an interesting study that was looking at the efficacy of honeybee versus squash bee pollination in squash. Were you going to bring that up?
No, but
Okay, well,
by all means, go ahead.
So, both of them will visit squash. But what the study found, and forgive me for forgetting the author, and maybe Vincent Tepedino was involved in it, but what they found was that even though the honeybees, in the absence of the squash bees, would be effective pollinators, in the presence of the squash bees, the pollination needs were completely fulfilled by the time the honeybees got up in the morning, basically.
Yeah.
The squash bees got out at 6 a.m. and were done by the
Took
time
care
the
of all
honeybees
the
came out at
flowers.
9 a.m. So,
yeah.
yeah.
And so when you're looking at bees, whether it's honeybees, whatever, like later in the day, if we were out here at like 11, when I think we'll all be at work or something, you'll see like bumblebees and honeybees like tripping over each other and like really like elbowing each other aside inside squash flowers. Like I imagine for bees, these things are like, I mean, maybe the nectar's particularly good. I don't know.
Well, it's
There's
particularly
tons of pollen.
copious. Yeah, I don't know,
Yeah.
but it's like falling into a swimming pool of
Yeah.
nectar for these bees.
Yeah. So they're awesome flowers.
She's back.
It's back. But so then, is this a native or not? And so the fun thing is that we'll start with the plants. So this is definitely not a native plant. This is a variety of squash that originates, I think, in northern South America, but butternuts basically. We have close relatives, Corbata pepo, which is, and squash are kind of confusing translating the species into familiar products, but let's say the pepo are like zucchinis, acorn squashes, and then what mostly we buy is pumpkins. Although really, any orange round squash can be called a pumpkin, and that can come from like 3 different species of squash. So the pepo was domesticated in, I think, like the middle south of the United States, as well as probably another spot, I think, in Central America or Mexico. And C. maxima, I think, is another South American. And so I forget, honestly, I'm not sure. I haven't been able to find which exact ones were cultivated by American Indians here. I'm betting it was C. pepo. But they were cultivated, right? But it was all pre-Columbian cultivated. And so they would have been seeds that had been probably domesticated, let's say, in Tennessee or something like that. And then sort of like, spreading with other plants, like north. But then grown here, maybe for, I don't know, 1,000 years? Who knows, before, like, colonists got here. And then the squash bees, like any of the commensals of the plant, including the much reviled squash vine borers, but also squash bugs. I imagine like maybe cucumber beetles too. I'm not sure. I haven't looked up maybe they all feed on close relatives that I'm not thinking of. But I'm betting they came along for the ride also. And so, squash bee might be like native, quote unquote, to like Tennessee or something, but doesn't care, if a flower opens up, like a mile down the river, got here eventually.
Yeah, because where do squash bees reproduce?
Like, where do they mate?
Like,
where do
the ones we're seeing here.
Oh,
where would they be reproducing at?
like nesting?
I'll just note that a bumblebee just flew by. It's our first I think first non-squash bee.
The bumbles get up pretty early too.
Yeah.
So one of the interesting things about squash bees is that they're probably nesting right here. They tend to nest right under the foliage of the squash plant. And in a place like this where squash plants are kind of distributed in a spotty way, if there is a squash plant somewhere being visited by squash bees, I would be surprised not to find that
surprised.
Early in the morning, but Tony's still fun.
there are likely, if there are not squash bees nesting already, there probably will be by the end of the season right under these leaves here. So the males like to hang out in the flowers overnight because they know the females are coming the next morning. And
it's like sleeping in the bar.
Exactly, yeah. So they hang out to be prepared when the females show up. Yeah.
So they're not being transported with a squash,
Not
right?
squash or transported
yeah,
as seed.
Yeah.
Or the fruit, yeah.
Or
So,
yes. But,
So-
but they're not right. They're not like living inside the.
yeah, when you
Yeah.
think of like insects that are associated with our food, I mean, I guess you wouldn't call these invasive insects, but when you think of insects that have,
What the hell are they?
yeah, when you've moved, that humans have moved, often, they're in the soil that around a plant, or they're infesting the plant in some way.
Emerald ash borer,
Yeah.
which was transported in wood, or like or what's the beetle that transports Dutch elm disease? Those bark beetles, whatever they are,
Yeah.
that were transported across the Atlantic in wood. Like that kind of thing.
So these have to leave the area, that they have to disperse naturally,
Right.
without trucks or ships
Right.
or horses or carriages, I guess.
Which,
Yeah.
during the period in which they were dispersing, everything had to disperse without trucks and ships for the most part. But
Or
even
horses,
now,
yeah.
Like think about like zucchini, which is so associated with like Italian cuisine, and a lot of times, right? I don't know. I mean, I remember being served zucchini when I was in Italy, and there's other
The
squash
name
bees.
that we use for it is Italian. Yeah.
Yeah, other squash bees in Italy.
I honestly don't know. That's something I probably should have read up on before I was
No,
focused
I don't.
on the
I'm gonna
moral
say I don't
ones.
think
All
so
right.
because I think I noticed when I got really serious about. I've sort of backed off. I was a little too into it because squash can take up a ton of space. But I lived in a different apartment building where we had a ton of garden space, and so I was like, and some of it just wasn't used for anything. I was like, all right, I'm putting squash back here, and so I had like tons of squash plants, and these are plants that could go like 40 feet per vine, And so I did a lot of research on pests. There are parts of the country, let's say like west of the Rockies, where they just don't have squash vine borers. And then I think in much of Europe or Australia or South Africa, places where they grow a lot of squash, there just aren't pests there. And so I'm gonna, since both those and the bees would transport themselves basically, I'm gonna guess no, there's no squash.
Yeah, I just did a quick Google search there, and based on those preliminary results, I did not find support for any old world squash bees. So there's two genera of
let's get
squash
into the
bees. So
biology
there's
of them.
the Peponapus and Xenoglossa. Both of them are Cucurbita specialists, and I think both of them are New World genera. So yeah, now I should say the real expert on this topic is actually a colleague of mine, Margarita Lopez Uribe, who wrote an awesome paper
I read
on
a couple
this.
years ago.
Yeah.
Go ahead, talk about it.
It's a fantastic paper, and she and her colleagues set out to tell the story of the spread of Peponapus pruinosa through North America following the cultivation of Cucurbita. They used some genetic methods to the idea being that when you trace a species along the path of its dispersal, you tend to have a reduction in genetic diversity the farther you get from its origin, because you get kind of bottlenecking events and such.
Which is how they know, that's why we say humans. One of the reasons we know humans evolved in sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah, I think you can use very similar tools. Yeah. My knowledge of this comes from her work.
Yeah.
But the initial domestication of Cucurbita traces back about 10,000 years to the initial one into it was now Mexico. And then there was a second domestication event in like the lower Midwest of what is now the United States, like Missouri or something.
Right, that's what we're
5,000
talking about, the
years
other
ago.
Pepo Domestication Center, yeah.
So the question was whether, there's a bumble right there. The question was whether Peponapus pruinosa spread with that initial domestication event of Cucurbita up through North America, and particularly into eastern North America, which is kind of the farthest removed from its native
we're
range.
at like the end of the distribution now.
We
except
are.
for like
I mean,
Maine
it
or
gets,
Nova Scotia or
yeah,
something.
it gets up
Yeah.
fairly far north, I think. Really, as far as the Cucurbita go. Or whether it was that initial expansion into like what is now the Midwest U.S. and then it spread east from there. And I think what she and her colleagues found was support for the idea that it was from the Midwest U.S. and probably associated with that second domestication event that the source population of Peponapus for the eastern United States came from. Really, really interesting study. I believe
Yeah.
Margarita is working now on another population genetics type study of Peponapus in Pennsylvania squash fields. So looking
neat.
forward to seeing that come together.
Yeah. Hi, podcast listeners. I should have had these notes ready before we started recording, but the paper that we're talking about is titled Crop Domestication Facilitated Rapid Geographic Expansion of a Specialist Pollinator, the Squash Bee Peponapus pruinosa, by Margarita Lopez Uribe, James Kane, Robert Minkley, and Brian Danforth, published in 2016 in the Proceedings of the Royal Society B.
And since we're so far north, where squash naturally occurred, and the associated bees, so these bees had to adapt to be able to overwinter for a much longer period of time than they normally would have.
Yeah, I mean, they originated in the subtropics, basically, in Central America. So yeah, that is.
But even if you're just going from the Mississippi Valley around Tennessee to Nova Scotia or something, or Maine, that's a hell of a difference there.
And these are soil nesting bees too, so
they would be killed by the frost.
Well, I mean, if they nest like
against.
deep enough that I think probably one of the reasons they can do this is because they nest fairly deep. I think their nests are usually about 20 centimeters deep, which is even spares them from shallow tillage sometimes, which is important for living in squash.
Yeah.
But an interesting thing
in
is
other words,
that
they don't get plowed up.
Yeah. I mean, you certainly can plow them up if you till too deeply. But so, as an aside, if you want to foster squash bees among your squash, then opt for a no-till or a minimal till
Which
approach.
is tough because that's the opposite advice of how to handle squash vine borers.
Oh man. Yeah.
Because their life cycle is they kill your squash plants. And then they pop out and they pupate in the soil, and I think spend the winter in the soil.
How deep do they?
That's the
go?
question.
Yeah. So you might be able to till to top 6 inches or something and spare the squash bees.
Sorry, but go ahead. You're talking.
But anyway,
these are important cultural controls,
Yeah.
right? That we need to parse out. By the way, I just want to, before I forget, Billy's eating lamb's quarters straight from the
It's the morning. I'm standing here. I'm looking at these lamb's quarters. Before I yank them out, I'll munch on them.
But with ground nesting bees, they often have pretty strong preferences for soil properties. But if you're going to be a ground nesting bee with a range from Mexico to Maine, then you have to be pretty tolerant of a whole range of soil types. And apparently squash bees must be, or perhaps it's that they just like the same soils that you can grow squash in. But I think they must be kind of a soil generalist in a way for a ground nesting bee.
Are they do they pollinate the native, what, burr cucumber? Is burr cucumber, what are our native cucumbers? Burr cucumber?
So what I understand of this is that I don't know that we have native cucumbers. I don't know. Actually, cucumbers, I don't know. I mean, the ones I'm familiar with are just the Cucurbita genus.
Yeah.
And in its strict sense, Pennsylvania has no native Cucurbita. But they've been cultivated here by humans, I don't know, for a couple thousand years, maybe? Mm-hmm. I'm not positive. Maybe it's
we do have plants in the same family, but not in the same
But I don't know if we do. I'm not sure.
It just occurred to me, sorry to interrupt, but I was watching the squash bee and it's kind of erratic flight pattern. And I bet the reason why we're seeing that uncharacteristic flight pattern is that these are males looking for females, not females looking for flowers. And so I think what it's doing is checking the flower for a female, being disappointed, and then going to the next one, but kind of swooping around. And it just kind of tackled that fly there. It was no doubt disappointed when it did that, but hi squirrels.
Wrong identity. I think that's what kind of bee is that? So now I got an entomologist here. So we got this black bee with big pollen.
Oh, so this is actually I think often called the black bee or something. This is Melisodes bimaculatus.
Okay.
So it's a fairly common bee that also likes squash pollen. This is a female, so I'm not going to just grab her, but I'll kind of try to
how to handle bees without getting stung a whole lot.
Yeah,
by Doug Swansler.
Let's see. So you can see the pollen all over her. One thing that's interesting about cucurbits is that they just have massive pollen grains. So they're so big that with the naked eye you can see individual pollen grains easily.
Yeah.
And that actually presents a real challenge for bees. It's like, how many beach balls can you pick up at once and take home? I
think you're closer, so check that one. I think it's got someone feeding in it.
Yeah. So this is the squash bee. I think that's a male
Okay, so we got another male.
in there.
All right. We'll let him drink, I guess. But
Yeah. But I think one of the reasons why squash bees can specialize on squash pollen is that they can deal with just the morphology of the pollen, which is a challenge for honeybees don't like it. Honeybees will get it on them and then scrape it off because it just is
you can't
an
pack
encumbrance.
it in the pouches quite the same way. Yeah.
You've got a lot of ants checking this one out too. So I think I interrupted a discussion of the nativeness of cucurbits in Pennsylvania. So where were we with?
We weren't. Tony was trying to look it up real quick.
Well, Burr cucumber is native,
Okay.
Great. Okay.
but it's
It's like native to not quite here.
We've got a Dulcovespula maculata hanging out over there, the bald-faced hornet, which is not technically a hornet since we.
but it's in the genus
It's a,
Sicyos, Sicyos or whatever. I don't know, Sicyos. And
Where is it native to?
Here.
Oh, okay.
So, but you're saying.
So
I
my
wonder if there's
understanding
squash
is
bees
that-
associated with it, or
I
they're
think they're
different
strictly
species.
cucurbita.
Okay.
I think they're. I could be wrong about that, but I'm pretty sure they're cucurbita specialists.
I gotta kill that. All right, I gotta figure out what to do. Sorry, I was slightly distracted by a gardening idea, which
Observing
is
some porcelain berry.
right. This hornet was loving the porcelain berry, but I don't love porcelain berry.
That's a native hornet there, or more accurately, a native aerial yellow jacket.
I know it's a. But I got.
I'm being facetious. That's our topic today, right?
Yeah, but this is the topic. I mean, so then
Oh my God! Well, speaking of
when you're
yellow jackets, have you seen that video of the guy?
this is unearthing the enormous yellow jacket nest.
No,
Oh.
this is like, oh my God, this guy.
Hey there.
Oh,
Ladies are spending thousands of dollars on collagen lip injections just to
Okay.
get those vibrant, luscious lips you've always wanted. Well, here's an easy tip. Just have 2 wash sting ya. Boom, boom. Right in the lip.
it's the guy making the most of some wasp stings.
Yeah, apparently he went to pick up some keys and then yellow jacket stung him right in the lips.
Oh man! All right.
But yeah, that.
Now I have to come to the defense of yellow jackets. They're not as aggressive as they're often reputed to be. It's just that their nests are so inconspicuous that people disturb their nests without realizing that there was ever a
you're
nest
mowing the
around.
lawn.
Yeah, I hit
you're-
one with a McLeod doing trail work once.
What's
And
that?
It's a giant like trail work rake
Okay.
device, and I hit and
It doesn't sound good at all.
oh yeah, and they were attacking my backpack for 45 minutes.
Because you left your backpack behind, is what you're saying?
Yeah,
Yeah, okay. Yeah,
They would have been attacking you for 45 minutes.
Yeah.
I know. So they have no native host species, technically speaking. They have a long cultivated, quote, exotic, unquote, here. And so, like, when you're a native gardener, like, it kind of had me I was sort of trying to rethink, like, what do we do about things? Because on the one hand, it's fun to talk about the squash bees, because they're bees, they're cute, they don't harm anything, they actually help your plants, or they help your plants fruit. But then, by the same token, the squash vine borer is also a native, or the same degree of nativeness that I hate and would wipe out if I had the chance. Or at least just limit to Delaware or something, I don't know. What is native, you know?
yeah.
And maybe
Or
even
what
more
matters.
than that, what matters and what is the connection between nativeness and mattering?
Right, so here we have like plant that like have been cultivated for so long around here, you know, that like, and they have this whole community of commensal insects. So if, like, the reason I like native stuff is because there's some kind of like heritage angle for where we are.
Yeah.
Check, we got that. And it, you know, is not a blank spot on the trophic web, you know, like,
Arborvitae.
yeah, the arborvitae right there. Except for the bagworms, what the hell eats arborvitae? And so, like, it's why you plant it, you know, because it's an old planting. I'm going to get rid of it. But the arborvitae is there because people plant them because they're successful, because nothing eats them. But then, from a perspective of someone who likes how things fit into local, you know, trophic webs, that means it's sort of like a blank spot on the landscape. There's nothing eating it, you know, there's nothing eating what eats it, et cetera, et cetera. All its, as Tony likes to put it, like all its nutrients are sort of locked up in its tissue, inaccessible to anything else until it dies and then decomposes, I guess. I don't know. But that's not the case for butternut squashes, even though they're not technically native.
Probably the place to start the conversation. Maybe there's two sides. There's a critique of the native non-native dichotomy, and there's a question of how we value things, right?
Yeah.
And I think that anybody who's thought it through, and in literature, I think this comes out that the native non-native dichotomy is more of like maybe a media polemic than a valid scientific category, because everything exists on a continuum. You could describe nativeness in terms of time since introduction, or but as
which we're kind of doing
means
here.
of introduction, like this. So, for example, squash has both been here for a long time and spread on its own. Well, it spread with cultivation. The squash bee then followed that cultivation, but in either case, it was not like it was taken across the Atlantic in ship ballast by accident.
Like the mugwort I'm about to yank out?
Yeah, exactly. So in that case, we might say that this is the most benign form of non-nativeness. You take something like the emerald ash borer or the mugwort that you just pulled up, and it was imported recently. It was imported
ship ballast.
Or in the case of ash borer and packing material, as a byproduct of human economic activity. And also, it's worth noting too that this squash plant is not causing any economic or ecological damage so far as we can tell, whereas the emerald ash borer has caused millions, if not billions, of dollars of damage, and it's going to wipe out most of a genus of trees in North America. So
a significant genus, yeah.
So the difference in our judgment there is not because one is native and the other is not, but because of the effects that they have. So I think on the one hand we need to, it's not tenable ultimately to value something based on its nativeness or non-nativeness. But you can go too far in that direction too, and I think some people just end up kind of throwing up their hands and have this really laissez-faire approach to.
I call it eco-nihilism, but
it's exactly what it is. And there's sort of this vague optimism that we're just letting evolution take its course or something. But I mean, A, we may or may not want evolution to take its course, right? Depending on what that course is. But B, this is not an unguided course. This is something being facilitated by our actions, and we have considerable control over. So
we do. And I'll quote the great economist John Maynard Keynes when someone said, "Oh, in the long term it'll work out," and he said, "In the long run, we're all dead."
Yeah.
So in the time it will take Arbor Vitae and Euonymus, is that the name of the other stuff over there? The variegated. Yeah. To acquire its suite of the commensals, to control it,
or to transform it into being beneficial, because if you have enough commensals, then that their nutrients are being allocated around and taken advantage of by other things.
It might be 1,000 years, and I would like my daughter and her descendants, to live in a rich place where we've got lots of critters running around and we can connect with nature that way, even if we're in a city.
Yeah. So there has to be some acknowledgement that the introduction of species is potentially ecologically disruptive.
Yeah.
And that, especially when we're the facilitators of it, we need to take responsibility for the damage that's caused and try to mitigate it. But just because something is not native does not mean it is for that reason.
I like watching. Sorry, a Bumblebee Land. Well, not Bumblebee. I'm sorry.
The Melisodes.
The Melisodes. I'm sorry, different category. And then see the squash bee fill it up.
Yeah.
Basically, the male's like, "Are you a female?" Oh, never mind. But in the meantime, the Melisodes gets knocked over sideways and it's like, what? What is Melisodes? It's a genus of.
It's a genus of bee. It's called the longhorn bee because it tends to have characteristically long antennae.
Okay.
And it also visits squash. The one that's common around here is Melisodes bimaculatus, which is this beautiful big black bee, solid
nice
black.
Bee. Yeah.
And then it looks really beautiful and it collects bright pollen because it's like a solid black bee with this dusting of colorful pollen.
We're looking at it. Yeah, I agree. Are they ground nesters also?
I believe so. I'm pretty sure.
I want to back up really quick and say and prompt Doug on a quick comment because I was about to explain bee biology and why would I do that next to Doug. Is that we think of honeybees nesting in these nests in hives, which is not characteristic of most bees. So when we talk about ground nesting bees, most bees are like single moms
Yeah.
or small little families doing what?
Yeah, they're single moms because the dads are out doing what we're watching them do now. They're just kind of stalking flowers, looking for all the
Looking for
females
more
they can
moms.
Find. Yeah. But so the vast majority of the upwards of 20,000 species of bee that live in the world, and in North America we have about 3,000, and in Pennsylvania we have. There's a student, Shelby Kilpatrick, at Penn State, who's updating the list of Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania checklist of
Oh, there you
bees.
go.
So I think we're, importantly, with this update, we've surpassed New York State, and there's some rivalry there.
Yeah, of course.
But we're upwards of 400, I think, or in that ballpark anyway, right here. And the vast majority of these are solitary, and the vast majority of those are ground nesting. They're solitary bees that build burrows underground. They're tunnels that either end in these terminal cells or branch into a bunch of cells. In some cases, they're even kind of linear, but they're basically a bunch of little nest cells underground connected by tunnels with an entrance at the top. They're very inconspicuous. It's easy to mistake it for something else or just to not see it at all. And the squash bee is one of those.
And they don't like make honey per se. They sort of like
No, they don't make honey at
they put
all,
the
yeah.
nectar and pollen together and pack that in as food, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
So they collect, in their case, they're squash specialists, so they collect cucurbita pollen and cucurbita nectar. Now usually specialist bees are more tolerant of different nectars. They don't care so much where the nectar comes from. But if you're a squash bee and you're visiting squash plants anyway, you're swimming in nectar. So they just combine nectar and pollen into this kind of patty that has all the nutritional components that a baby squash bee needs to grow up on. And they'll lay an egg on that patty. They'll seal up the cell and start working on a new one. And so for these bees, the mother dies before these bees even hatch, or if they hatch, they're little tiny larvae, and they'll develop throughout the growing season, and then I believe they overwinter as what's called a pre-pupa. So it's right before pupation. I think the larva defecates. It has one kind of defecation event, and then it spins its cocoon.
Takes
and
a giant
it's a pre-pupa,
poop and then spins a cocoon.
yeah, and they eat all summer, and
From
then,
now
then
on.
they poop.
Every time I have to go to the bathroom, I'm going to refer to it as a defecation event.
It's an event. Yeah,
If you only do it once in the summer, it's an event.
I would say so.
But so then the overwinter is this pre-pupa, and different bees overwinter in different stages, but the pre-pupa stage is common, and then they'll emerge the following year. And there are some bees that are actually bivoltine and will have 2 generations in the summer. But
Yeah. So that is like, in other words, that is most of beedom.
Oh, yes, yeah.
And so
honeybees are exceptional in all kinds of ways. They're really
Yeah.
oddballs in the bee world.
Those like bee houses, like native bee houses people make, where they're like all these different
yeah,
like
I'm trying to look. I tied a bunch of sticks to the fence somewhere
yeah,
along
like
here,
sticks and like bamboo and do they actually ever utilize those? 'Cause
Oh yeah, they do. Yeah. In fact, I have a neighbor in Philly who just like ties together any hollow thing he has, like the old plastic disposable razor handles and stuff, and just like strings them together with rubber band and the shaft of a pen or something, anything that's cylindrical and hollow, and bees use them. They do have preferences for different materials. Like they seem to prefer natural materials, like
so these
like hollow
are
reeds.
groups of bees that tend to nest in hollow
Yeah,
stems.
so I
of
should
things.
say
Yeah.
that like the of the bees that do not nest in burrows underground, most of the remainder nest in hollow stems or similar cavities, and only a small number nest in like tree hollows, like you imagine for honeybees.
Yeah.
So yeah, they do work. You have to be careful if you just like put the same bundle of sticks out year after year. It's going to tend to accumulate pathogens and stuff, and so it's a good idea to clean them out. Some people use disposable paper inserts, though. So I
I mean, there's no shortage of let's say Japanese knotweed.
exactly. Yeah. In fact, I'm hoping to. So this year, I've set up a bunch of these bee hotels.
So we
around the city.
accompanied Doug for some of his research in the recent Buzzing Hard episode of the podcast, where we saw one of these bee hotels.
Yeah. So suffice it to say, the bee hotels are not buzzing hard. They're not.
Okay.
So I think the issue is that we just have either the nests themselves are not attractive enough, or they're just we've got 12 of them in Philadelphia, and it might just not be in the right spots. And so I wasn't shocked by that because you often get low occupancy rates with these things. But the approach I want to take is to go out this year and harvest just a ton of Japanese knotweed and chop it up into suitable lengths and stuff a bunch of PVC pipes with them and give them out to whoever.
Japanese knotweed is one of these ones where I think we can almost all agree that we don't want it.
Well, you know, it actually
it performs an ecosystem service of stabilizing eroding banks, I guess.
Well, it is. So I don't want to come across as advocating for Japanese knotweed, but bees love it.
Yeah, no, I've seen I've seen flowering Japanese knotweed that is like
it's just
swarmed with pollinators,
and not just honeybees, but you see wasps and flies and stuff on it. So it seems to occupy a very similar niche as goldenrod for flower visiting insects in the fall. So. If you have to choose a devastating invasive that's going to drive out a lot of native plants,
create a big
at least it's a food source.
Yeah, I guess so.
But no, let's cut it down.
Any flower though, will be
and make it into bee nests.
Yeah.
I hate Japanese knotweed. I studied invasive shrubs, and I did look at my research and I did see the results, and I do think that it is good to remove the shrubs and get the native ones in there. But when you look at a forest and the understory is bush honeysuckle and privet and it doesn't appear that different. It's the shrubs are basically been replaced. Like if you know what you're looking at, it's different.
Yeah.
But when you see
autumn olive, Jesus.
When you see a stream that's been invaded by Japanese knotweed, it completely transforms the look, like nothing else really, and that just kills me when you have these beautiful streams and like the banks are just covered in this plant. It just really changes the look of the forest.
Research reference. You were checking how many bugs were eating natives versus exotics.
Yeah,
and you were finding
it's like about a quarter of the invasives. You have 4 times as many on the natives.
Right. All right, so I think we've been out here a good while, and there's a few grasshoppers in here. Thanks for an episode. If you like the podcast, please like us on your favorite podcast listening app, whatever you're using to listen to this. Tell your friends about it, tell your mom about it, tell everybody about it. Recommend this episode to any gardeners you know who like squash. Keep a closer eye on your bees, because there's a lot more out there besides honeybees, and they're fascinating. If you want to get a hold of us, email us at urbanwildlifecast@gmail.com. You can hit us up on Twitter at UrbWildlifeCast and find us on Facebook.
And we'll provide a link to the Yellow Jacket lip guy.
I'll put some links on the website to the papers we discussed, as well as the Yellow Jacket lip guy, of course, so that you know what we were laughing at when you couldn't see it. Oh, wait. And I want to make a special thanks to Doug, who doesn't live in Philadelphia, who drove in from 3 hours away.
No, I grew up here, so I
know, but
here.
Still, it's
feels like
I sort of think of you as around because you're doing your research, but I think you drove in for this, so I appreciate that a lot. Thank you. And hey, podcast listeners, one last note that's a development since we were out there recording this. We now have a Patreon account. This is a way that you can chip in a few bucks, basically help us get better recording equipment, microphones in particular, and provide everybody with a better listening experience. Please go to patreon.com/urbanwildlifecast to help us out.